And there are many factors that play a role in this election campaign. The policies of the different candidates, their personalities, and the different tactics that they have employed. But there's one factor that we cannot overlook in analyzing these elections, and that is the role of money in the election campaigns. This is nothing unique for IFES. IFES has worked with this issue in over 40 countries so far. So as in the previous panels, we will ask the speakers to make their presentations, after which we will open the floor for comments and questions. Commissioner Weintraub.
Thank you, Magnus. I want to welcome all of you to the United States. I'm so delighted to see such a large and diverse group, including several old friends of mine and hopefully some new ones. As Magnus indicated, the Federal Election Commission is an unusual election commission in that it does not actually run elections. The registering of voters, counting of votes, printing of ballots, all of that is handled at the state and local level in the United States. What we do at the Federal Election Commission is administer and enforce a set of laws and regulations that are all about money and politics. And there's a lot of it in the United States. But in order to understand how our rules work, one has to start with the First Amendment to our Constitution, which says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And this is a very cherished right that we have here in our country, the right of any citizen to speak about any topic, including criticizing people in power, making sharp criticisms of the government, and knowing that they will not suffer repercussions as a result of that. It is very treasured here, and as a result, our courts are very protective of it, to the point where they also include, within the protections of the First Amendment, the right to raise and spend as much money as a candidate or any other person wants to in order to get their political message out. Now, side by side with these strong protections of free speech, we also have long-standing concerns about the potentially corrupting influence of money in politics. So, for example, if you go back over 100 years, in 1896, it became known that about $3.5 million in corporate spending was backing the ultimately successful McKinley ticket. And $3.5 million in 1896 was a whole lot of money. So, as a result of the publicity that came out of that, Teddy Roosevelt ultimately proposed a rule that corporations could no longer make political contributions, and that law passed in 1907. Now, Roosevelt was part of the same party and had in fact been McKinley's second vice president, causing one prominent donor to say, you know, we bought him, he just didn't stay bought. So we have this long-standing concern about money in politics, side by side with our protections for the First Amendment. And over the years, through the 1900s, various laws were enacted, but it wasn't until the 1970s that we adopted a comprehensive regime to address campaign finance. And the law, as originally written, included contribution limits, source restrictions, expenditure limits, public financing of presidential campaigns, a robust disclosure system, and the creation of an independent agency to administer and enforce those laws, the Federal Election Commission. And this was as a result of a 1971 law that was amended throughout the 1970s. The law was almost immediately challenged, and in 1976, our Supreme Court came up with their seminal campaign finance ruling in the case of Buckley v. Vallejo, where they upheld the contribution limits. They said they were necessary to deal with the reality or appearance of corruption inherent in a system permitting unlimited financial contributions. Remember that when Trevor starts talking to you about independent spending in a few minutes. The court, however, struck down expenditure limits. And our court has, in their First Amendment jurisprudence, taken the position that restricting the amount of money that one spends is the same thing as restricting the amount of speech that a political participant can make. And therefore, they struck down expenditure limits stating the concept that government may restrict the speech of some elements in our society in order to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment. This is how the court felt it could best promote the most robust debate about political issues by having no limits on what anyone could say. This is not the only way that a system could be devised. I see we have some friends from Canada here in the room. If you were to go north to Canada, you would find a very different system, despite our much shared history. In Canada, expenditure limits were upheld by their court because the court felt that in the absence of spending limits, it would be possible for the affluent or a number of persons pooling their resources and acting in concert to dominate the political discourse, depriving their opponents of a reasonable opportunity to speak and be heard, and undermining the voters' ability to be adequately informed of all views. So here you have two neighboring countries, both devoted to promoting the most robust discussion of all the issues, and they come up with very different ways of approaching it. And I'm sure that there are many other permutations on how one could try to promote free speech and also protect against the corruption of money in politics, and probably many of your countries have different methods that fall one place or another place or somewhere in between. So the law that was left did contain a robust disclosure system. That was something that the courts have routinely and repeatedly upheld in our country as being very important for an informed electorate. So we have a system where candidates, political parties, and groups of people who get together to influence the election have to register with the FEC. They have to file regular reports, generally monthly or quarterly reports. They have to disclose all of the sum total of all their contributions, and they have to list the names of every individual who has given more than $200, and where they live, when they gave the money, who their employer is. Similarly, they have to list where the money's going, what they're spending their money on. Every expenditure of $200 or more has to be itemized. No one can give more than $2,500 directly to a candidate for any one election. And certain groups or individuals are prohibited from making contributions directly to candidates and parties. That is corporations, labor unions, foreign nationals, and government contractors. We have a public financing system, but frankly, it's not very much in use anymore. If people want to talk about it, I'd be happy to answer questions about it, but since it's not the predominant method of financing, I don't want to waste my small amount of time here. In addition, we have disclosure of outside advertising. So when anyone spends more than $10,000 for an ad, and this happens actually fairly frequently, they have to file a report with the Federal Election Commission within 24 or 48 hours, depending on when in the cycle it is and what the ad says. So we have a great deal of information that is available to our voters throughout the election cycle. What do we know as a result of all of this disclosure? Well, we know that in 2008, there was roughly $5.3 billion that was raised and spent on electing our president, our members of the House of Representatives, and 1/3 of the Senate. And in 2012, my statisticians tell me that already we have spent over $6.7 billion. So it's very, very expensive. However, let me just give you a couple of points of comparison. It's a very large economy. We have a $3.6 trillion federal budget. And last week, if you were here, we celebrated the holiday of Halloween. It's a children's holiday. The kids dress up in costume, and they go door to door and collect candy, and everyone puts decorations out. It's a lot of fun. And apparently, according to the Retail Federation, we spent $8 billion on Halloween last week. That's a lot of candy. So when you think about spending $6 or $7 billion on electing the government that's going to administer a $3.6 trillion budget and make decisions about war and peace and health care and public safety and how to respond to hurricanes, one has to view it in light of the size of the overall economy. Our presidential candidates alone have raised over $1 billion. But interestingly, they raised even more money in 2008. Usually, it gets more and more expensive every year, and the total amount of spending is higher than it was in the last presidential election. But in fact, in 2008, where there were contested nominations for both the Republican and the Democratic nominee, and there was a lot of excitement generated by then Senator Obama's campaign. $1.682 billion was raised. And I want to make a point about how this money comes in, because an awful lot of it is coming in very small amounts. In 2008, almost a third of the money that was donated, of that $1.682 billion, came in donations of $200 or less. And this year, of the $1.171 billion, almost half, $584 million, was donated in increments of $200 or less. So there are a lot of people around the country who, as we say in this country, they want to put their money where their mouth is. They see a candidate, they're inspired by them, or they hate the other guy. It happens both ways. They read something, they watch the debates, they get a text message from a campaign or see something on the internet, and they're inspired. And they want to send in a small contribution. And people will send in small checks. They'll send in a lot of money. A lot of these small donations come in over the internet. And we this year adopted donations by text messaging, $10 on your cell phone that people can text to candidates. So I think that the fact that a lot of the money is being generated by very small contributions, again, is a protection against the corrupting influence of money in politics. Although, as I said, Trevor's going to focus on the independent expenditures, and there's some fairly large donations that are backing these independent expenditures this year. And what is this money being spent for? Well, it is, for the most part, being spent to communicate with voters. Roughly $700 million has been spent by these presidential candidates on advertising, another $200 million on mail. They spend money on fundraising, on payroll, on travel, on polling. And the reason that we know all this is because we have this very robust disclosure system. So, as I said, a lot of money coming in, a lot of money going out, but at least, for the most part, there are some holes in the system, but for the most part, we know where that money's coming from and we know where it's going.
Thank you, Ellen, very much. I think that does give us a good sense of the overall funding for this election. As Ellen said, and where I'd like to start, this is the first election, basically in our lifetime, since 1976, where there is no public funding of the presidential candidates. It's not that the money doesn't exist, it's sitting in the Treasury, but we have had a public funding system which is voluntary, again required under our First Amendment freedom of speech that Ellen referred to, and I'm going to talk about in a moment. And this year, neither President Obama or Governor Romney has decided to voluntarily participate in that system. The reason is that they decided there wasn't enough money in it to pay for the campaigns they wanted to run. In 2008, Senator McCain participated in the system. That meant he didn't take any private money for his own general election campaign. He could help raise money for the party, but his campaign got a check from the U.S. Treasury of about $90 million, and that's what he spent for the general election. By contrast, then Senator Obama, who was raising a lot of money over the internet, was having a very good fundraising year, decided that if he didn't take the public money, he could raise more private money. And boy, was he right. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars in private money, all within the federal limits, and spent it. That's not, I think, why Senator Obama won. It was a bad year to be a Republican running for president, but the lesson that came out of that is that if your opponent is not going to take public funding, you had better not do it either, or you will be badly outspent. So this year, neither of them are taking the public money. As I say, that's a really historic change, and one of the effects of that has been they have spent a lot of time going around the country fundraising, doing 3 and 4 different events a day. That's unique. The other piece of this election that is unique is that it's the first election that has been fought since our courts changed the way that money is spent in politics. Commissioner Weintraub referred to independent expenditures, and what that means roughly is that instead of money that is given to the candidate and they spend it, or money that is given to the political parties and they spend it, instead it is money that is spent by outside groups, by people who are not candidates and not parties, but very interested in the election. They may be wealthy individuals, they may be corporations or unions, they may be interest groups concerned about the environment or abortion or guns or any number of other issues. But thanks to 2 Supreme Court decisions, that money has ballooned in this year's election. I'm hoping that a slide is going to come up. Yes. Commissioner Weintraub mentioned the First Amendment, and for those of you who haven't actually seen the First Amendment, what it basically says is that Congress can't do a number of things. And right in the middle of it is, it cannot abridge the freedom of speech or of the press. So what does abridging the freedom of speech mean? It starts with the fact that when we became an independent country and we got rid of the British royal governors, for the first time, Americans could say what they thought about the government without being threatened with arrest and carried off to prison by British troops. It meant that a printer could run a newspaper and publish what he or she wanted, and the printing press wouldn't be seized. So that's where we started, was actual speech. All right, it's 30 years later, and life is a little more complicated. The court has talked about not only speech, which means you and I stand on a street corner, but amplified speech. You and I stand on a street corner with a bullhorn, or ride through the streets with a bus that is blaring noise. Is there a limit to that? Yes, it turns out. If it's too loud, if you disturb other people, if you do it late at night in front of someone's house, there may be limits on that sort of speech. Then we have what the court has called symbolic speech. And the example of that is when you protest government policy in this country by burning the U.S. flag. The Supreme Court has said that that is an act of speech, even if you never say a word, but you simply stand there and light and burn the flag. The court says that you are symbolically speaking and protesting, and that's protected by this same language, the freedom of speech. What about spending money in elections? The court said a number of years ago that if individuals want to go out and spend their own money to take out an advertisement on radio and television to talk about candidates and say elect one of them or don't elect the other, that is freedom of speech, and it cannot be limited or restricted by the government. So if I'm running for office and I happen to have a lot of money, I can spend it on my own campaign, and that's protected by our First Amendment. If I'm not running for office but I have a lot of money and I want to tell you who to vote for, I can do that as well, because that is my own speech. However, that doesn't apply to giving money to candidates, because the court said that's different. You're not spending the money if you give it to the candidate. The candidate is spending the money. And so you are symbolically showing you support the candidate by giving them a check. But it doesn't make any difference symbolically whether that check is for $10 or $10 million in terms of what you're showing, which is I like this person, I'm giving them money. But the court says it does make a difference to how we run our elections and to corruption and potential corruption. And if a candidate is given $10 million by an individual, they're going to be very grateful, that's a fact of life, and everyone else is going to think something corrupt may be occurring, that they have bought the candidate. So the court said you can limit how much you give, how much an individual gives to a candidate. At the moment, you can prohibit corporations from giving at all to candidates, but you can't limit how much that individual can actually go out and spend on their own. So that's the theory of the difference between contributions that can be limited under the First Amendment and independent spending, which may not be limited. So that's where we were when we came in 2010 to a case called Citizens United. And in that case, a corporation said, I want to speak about elections. I don't know where that slide came from. Maybe we'll exist without slides. The court said, the company came to the Supreme Court and said, I want to spend money in U.S. elections. Can we get rid of those slides? Just turn that off, thank you. I'd like to spend money in U.S. elections, and we're a corporation. Under U.S. law, as Commissioner Weintraub has explained, corporations had been banned from spending money in elections. And the court said, there is a fundamental First Amendment right here to speak. We know that under the First Amendment. This court said, we think it applies to corporations just as it applies to individuals. Now, that was a new, I think, revolutionary thought, because up until that point, the courts had said corporations are not individuals, they're created under legislation, they're taxed differently, they don't die, they keep going in perpetuity. People give them money because of commerce, not because they want to help their political speech. And for all these reasons, the government can treat corporate speech differently than individuals. But in Citizens United, the Supreme Court said, we think that's wrong. The government's role is not to pick and choose among political speakers. The government's role is to stay out of the political marketplace and let whoever wants to speak about politics do so. That's what free speech is. That's what's protected by the First Amendment, no matter who is speaking. And the court said it won't be corrupting because it'll be independent of the candidates. So you're not giving the money to the candidate, but you're spending it on your own. And the court said also it'll be fully disclosed, so we'll know who is actually speaking. And therefore, citizens can make their own judgments about that speech, and shareholders will know what their corporations are doing. So that was Citizens United. In a case that came right after that called Speech Now, another court said, well, if this is a right that every individual has to speak independently in unlimited amounts, and now the Supreme Court has said that corporations have the same right and unions have the same right, then you should be able to do it together. If I can do it on my own and write a check for an ad, and Commissioner Weintraub can write her check for her ad, why can't we get together, open a bank account, and jointly run ads? They're still independent of the candidates, so they're still, in theory, not corrupting. And the court said that seems okay to us. So that gave us what we call super PACs in this year's election. That's a very short name that the press invented for a non-connected, independent, expenditure-only political action committee. You can see why they needed a short name. But the point of it is you can get a group of individuals, corporations, and unions giving unlimited amounts to these committees, and they will spend unlimited amounts for candidates. And we did not have that before this year. Now, the good news about all that is that it is reported to the Federal Election Commission. It is publicly disclosed by all those good people over there who work for Commissioner Weintraub. And you can go online, fec.gov, and find out who gave to the super PACs and how much they're spending. So, as I say, that's the good news. The bad news is that there are other groups spending money for the same type of ads, and they're not disclosing who their donors are. You can't go online and find them at the Federal Election Commission. This is really an accident of our laws, or it's a result of the way spending in this country has developed. But let me give you the example. Commissioner Weintraub and I have our Political Action Committee, that super PAC. We are very interested in the whole battle over climate change. I won't disclose whether we think there is climate change or whether we think it's a lot of malarkey, but we're very interested in it. So we decide to form a group, a nonprofit organization, that is going to talk about climate change. Not political. We don't register with the Federal Election Commission because this is a social welfare group. We're going to lobby Congress. We're going to urge research on climate change. Maybe we're going to take out advertising that talks about hurricanes and says, gosh, there seem to be a lot more than there used to. Who knows? So we formed this group, and we're the same people who have a super PAC, but they're legally separate. Then we decide that it would be really useful for this whole battle over climate change if we told voters where candidates stood on climate change. And not only that, but that we took out ads pointing out that President Obama has been enacting regulations that will limit what coal companies can do, and he's been spending time trying to create wind power, and he's been spending government money for electrical car companies. We may think that's good or bad. We'll let you know when we run our ads. But suddenly, we're running election ads, talking about Obama in the middle of the election, saying what he's done, and we are legally allowed, if we want to, at the end of it, to say, defeat President Obama on Tuesday, or re-elect President Obama on Tuesday. But the distinction is, it's not our primary purpose. It's not what we are supposed to be principally doing. Therefore, we're an NGO, not a political committee. Therefore, we don't report who our donors are. So we have these two committees next to each other, run by the same people. One reports all its donors and one doesn't. Now, let's just finish that hypothetical and say that in the door now walks Donald Trump or George Soros or somebody with a lot more money than we have. And he says, I really want to defeat Obama. I really want to elect Obama. I don't want to put my name on the ads. I don't want people to know that I'm giving you $50 million. If my name were Adelson, that would actually be a correct analogy. So I'll give you that money. You spend it. You run those ads. And no one will ever know that the money came from me. Well, that's where we are in this election. And we have not been there before in anything like the scale we're seeing today. There are, the latest figures I have seen, something like $700 million of advertising. And if you look at this, we have our charts back, the green is undisclosed funding. So more than half of all the ads being run on behalf of Republican candidates, primarily Governor Romney, are from undisclosed sources. On the Democratic side, a very small percentage are from undisclosed sources. That's something novel in our election spending. The next thing, thank you for that slide, the next thing that we are facing is that the Supreme Court said in Citizens United that it didn't matter where the money came from. The point was that there was free speech and the government shouldn't be limiting it. But it turns out the court didn't really mean that. It just meant that it was okay for there to be free speech by corporations and the government couldn't limit that, because we had a case that came afterwards in which a variety of people who were living in the United States, working in the United States, paying taxes in the United States, but were not U.S. citizens, said, we would like to spend money in this election too. We happen to be Canadian citizens, and we should be allowed to do this, even though law says you have to be a U.S. citizen to spend this money. There, the Supreme Court took a different view and said, it does make a difference who you are. The government has a legitimate traditional reason to limit foreign national spending. So we now have a First Amendment that means corporations can speak, but foreign nationals can't. What's the difference if the theory is that speech is the highest value? The answer is the Supreme Court said so. So as a lawyer, I find this disturbing because it isn't really consistent. The next thing the court said is that this spending is going to be completely independent of candidates, and that's why it's not corrupting, which makes sense. If Ellen's running for office and I come over and I chat with her and I tell her I'm going to give her a lot of money and support her, and I'm going to spend it independently, that seems to me, if we have those conversations, that's just as corrupting as if I give her the money and say, you go ahead and spend it. If instead I talk to her about what she needs and how I'm going to do it. The problem is the law is very narrow in prohibiting this sort of coordination. It says basically that Ellen, if she's a candidate, and I can't talk about specific advertising content. But The law allows, as interpreted by the Federal Election Commission, the law allows the candidate, Ellen, to come to a fundraiser for my independent expenditure group. It allows her to thank the donors and say, you know, this is really important and I appreciate everything you're doing. It allows me to hire her former campaign manager to run my independent expenditure group. It allows me to meet with her in the middle of my independent expenditures and talk about issues that are important to her, as long as I don't discuss the specific advertising I'm running. So the point I'm making is the Supreme Court thought this should all be unlimited because it was totally independent of candidates and therefore would not be corrupting. The reality is it's not independent of candidates, and I think we all therefore worry about the potential corruption when individuals are meeting with candidates, are close to candidates, and are spending an enormous amount of money to elect or defeat them. So that's what you're seeing in this election that is different than before out of these super PACs and out of these nonprofits. So I agree with Ellen that the fact we're spending $6 billion is not shocking. We spend $6 billion on other things that are less worthy. But where that money is coming from, how we're raising it, how it's being spent, how much of it is not publicly disclosed are all issues I think we're concerned about. Thanks.
Okay, we'll try again with the slides. We'll see if it works. I want to sort of try and look at sort of the patterns that we're seeing in this election. And some of the things that Ellen and Trevor have said will be reflected in this. These are presidential campaign receipts as of the end of August. So that's the end of the primary season. The Obama campaign had raised $342.3 million, the Romney campaign $217.2 million. The Obama Victory Fund and Romney Victory Inc. are both joint fundraisers between the candidates and the parties. The DNC is the Democratic National Committee, the RNC is the Republican National Committee. The reason this is interesting, I think, is because the money that's raised by the Obama campaign, that's money the Obama campaign can decide how to spend. It can decide what ads to run. It can decide if it wants to put money in terms of people on the ground, getting out the vote, identifying voters. They have more of that than the Republicans had. In this election, unlike 4 years ago, I think when all is said and done, we're not going to see huge discrepancies between the amount of money that the Democrats in the Obama campaign had and the Republicans and the Romney campaign. But the way they're raising their money is different, and that has implications for how they're able to spend it. This was cash on hand, again, at the end of August. As you can see, the Obama campaign had over twice as much as the Romney campaign. So going into the general election, the Obama campaign had more money, again, that it controlled, whereas the the Romney campaign was more dependent on or reliant on joint fundraisers, and you'll see in a minute, super PACs that Trevor just referred to. These are campaign receipts in September. Again, Obama raised a little bit more than Romney, but probably not a significant amount. These are individual contributions to the end of September. It shouldn't say primary. I updated the slide, and I forgot to take out that word. Ellen mentioned that we're seeing almost half the money that's coming in this election in amounts of $200 or less. But it's very different when you compare the two campaigns. The Obama campaign has raised over half of its money in amounts of $200 or less. Only 13% are coming in large, maxed out chunks of $2,500. The Romney campaign, almost half of their money came in amounts of $2,500 or less. This has real implications for the candidates in terms of raising money. Those people who give $200 or less, it's going to take them a while to get to $2,500. So the Obama campaign can go back to those people again and again and again and again, and they have. You know, can you give $14? Can you give $35? Again and again and again. It's going to take a while to aggregate to $2,500. For the Romney campaign, people that give them $2,500 in the primary or $2,500 in the general, that's it. They can't go back to them again. So the Obama campaign, I think we'll see at the end, has more capacity for raising money than probably the Romney campaign does. These are campaign receipts through mid-October. And these are just the first 2 weeks in October, first 17 days in October. So as Ellen said, this is going to be a very expensive election. The Obama campaign raised $77 million the first 2 weeks in October. The Romney campaign, $52 million. Again, it gets to the issue of how they're able to spend their money. The Obama campaign just has more money under its control than does the Romney campaign. Even though, you look at total amount raised by the Democrats and Republicans, the Republicans actually did slightly better in those first 2 weeks in October. Trevor mentioned the super PACs. Restore Our Future is a super PAC supporting the Romney campaign. They had raised, as of mid-October, $131.6 million and had $24 million cash on hand. Priorities USA is the super PAC supporting the Obama campaign. They consistently, through this cycle, have trailed what Restore Our Future has raised, and they had much less cash on hand as of mid-October. But I don't think that's all that important because the Obama campaign has so much more money that it can spend. But there's really been an imbalance in terms of what the super PACs on the Democratic and Republican side. There are more on the Republican side. They're raising a lot more money. And that sort of gets to, I think, to the point that Trevor made about the disparity between disclosed and undisclosed money. Much more undisclosed money on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. The amount of money spent by super PACs and aligned groups, so these are not just super PACs, but as Trevor suggested, some of the NGO groups, the outside groups. On the Obama side, $120 million. On the Romney side, $302 million. So again, we've seen very different, even though the total amount raised, when you look at all the campaigns and the parties and the outside groups, may be roughly the same or close to or not a huge discrepancy. The amount of money raised by outside money is much higher on the Republican side than it is on the Democratic side. I just want to talk very briefly about the Senate races. These are the most expensive Senate races. The race in Massachusetts is the most expensive. This is just candidate spending. This is the seat that Scott Brown won in a special election following Senator Kennedy's passing. He's the incumbent. Elizabeth Warren is running against him, and they've spent a tremendous amount of money. But what's interesting, okay, watch this. If you look at candidate and outside groups, Massachusetts is second, okay, but Virginia is first. And what's notable about this slide is you will see that in a number of races, the amount of money spent by outside groups exceeds the amount of money that's spent by the candidates themselves. In neighboring Virginia, I know some of you are going there tomorrow, outside groups have exceeded what's spent by Tim Kaine and George Allen, the two Senate candidates. Wisconsin, the same thing. Indiana, the same thing. Now, look at Massachusetts, okay? It's the most expensive race, almost no outside money. And there's a reason for that. Both candidates early on said, we don't want outside groups to be involved in this race. If an outside group comes in and spends money in the race, we will take money, campaign funds that we've raised, and donate it to a charity. When they made this statement, I think most of us who study campaign finance were skeptical that this would actually work. I would put myself in that group. But it looks like it has. There's almost no outside money in Massachusetts, even though it's a very, very expensive race. Virginia, on the other hand, is a different story. So I think we've seen a couple of different things in this election. Neither presidential candidate is going to be vastly outspent, as McCain was in 2008. The big story, I think, when all is said and done, is going to be the role of super PACs and other outside groups, both at the presidential level and also in Senate and House elections. So I will leave it there.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Magnus, in particular. And I'd like to start by thanking IFES for this very kind invitation. Well, I only have like 10 minutes, so I'm going to be very succinct. I guess I'm the only one on the panel who's more or less seeing this from the outside, as I'm not a U.S. citizen. And for that reason, and also for the reason that I work at the Organization of American States, I have to tread carefully. So I'm gonna, generally speaking, I'm gonna try to reflect a little bit on some of the issues that come up in campaign finance discussions, rather than going into the detail of what's happening in the US campaign. I guess it would be slightly unbecoming for me to do that. Having said that, I'll say right off the bat that even from the perspective of an outsider, such as myself, some of the trends that we're witnessing in the US election when it comes to campaign finance are indeed disturbing, particularly if you know a little bit about the background of campaign finance legislation in the US. I mean, the fact that for, not entirely, but in many different ways, the caps on campaign contributions have come tumbling. The fact that there's a much greater degree of lack of transparency in the system in a country whose strength when it came to campaign finance regulation was precisely the ability to know where the money came from. The fact that the public funding system has been practically dismantled at this point, as was mentioned before. I mean, all those things are probably not good for democracy. In some ways, we've gone back to the pre-Watergate era, but with the knowledge, with a very clear knowledge of what the lack of regulation can bring. My sense is that even though, you can go back in time, over a century and see that the issue of campaign finance was being talked about in the US, the salience of the issue is much greater now. And even though we're fully aware of the perils of a practically deregulated system, that's what the system seems to be going back to. And this state of things create a tendency, and you come across this very often in Washington debates, creates a tendency, to run for the door and do something crazy about this because, the situation is so bad. And I would caution against that. Campaign finance debates are ripe for political posturing and are ripe in terms of the kind of myth, of the set of myths that gets perpetuated in discussions and that get repeated over and over and over. Get repeated so often and so much and so loudly that they end up in many cases, and not just in the US, guiding policy responses to the problem. And that's the kind of thing that we should beware against. I would say, and the list could be longer, but I'm going to mention 5 things that I would like us to be aware of, that are assertions that get made continuously in campaign finance debates and that, quite frankly, help very little policy, the design of policy responses. Number 1 is this notion that money determines electoral results. I mean, it would be foolhardy to deny that money creates obstacles, that money creates thresholds, that when if you don't have, in a country such as the US, if you don't have a certain amount of money, it is very difficult to get your message across as a candidate. But this doesn't mean that there's a kind of inevitability that those who spend the most win. That's just not the case. It's not the case in the US, and it's not the case anywhere. Whenever you come across that kind of assertion, We have to remember the Michael Huffingtons of this world, the Meg Whitmans of this world, and we have to remember an example that always comes to my mind is Álvaro Vargas Llosa, the famous Peruvian writer. This is a wonderful example of someone very well known, of course, who in the 1990 election in Peru was outspent by a factor of 62 to 1 by Alberto Fujimori, the eventual winner. He was outspent, I correct, Mario Vargas Llosa outspent 62 to 1 Fujimori, the eventual winner. He got soundly beaten by a guy who basically stood atop an old tractor wearing a poncho. So whenever this kind of assertion comes to mind, remember those examples. There's no such inevitability as many people in the media would like to tell us. The second issue that I would like to bring up here is, and it's been mentioned here, that while in US elections, electoral costs are going up, campaign costs are going up, well, we don't know by how much, quite frankly, because the picture is very different according to the parameter that we use. And there are several different parameters that we can use when having this discussion. I mean, I'm going to give one example. I mean, if you take the cost of congressional campaigns in the US, between 2002 and 2008, and 2010, the total cost of congressional campaigns roughly doubled. But the average cost of each campaign actually went up by about 20%. It was a much more moderate increase. So depending on the parameter that you choose to illustrate your point, the picture can be dramatically different. And I'm going to give you an even more extreme example, which I find very interesting. I mean, a few years ago, a team of political scientists from MIT came up with a very, counterintuitive assertion that as a proportion of GDP, the cost of the election of 1912 was actually greater than the cost of the election of 2000 in the US. So all I'm saying, I'm not saying that costs are not going up. All I'm saying is that the picture is much more complicated when we go into the details of the facts. And when we tease out different possible parameters that we can use to test whether that explosive increase is true or not. And we also have the fact that it's been mentioned here that I find great, and I've heard Ellen, making this point several times, that what is being spent currently in the U.S. in this campaign is more or less the same that the country spends, celebrating Halloween, which is, I find that, a great parameter if you're talking about, comparison points. And regarding the cost, I would like to make another point, which I find very important, and it's often overlooked in this discussion, which is that the absolute level of campaign expenditures tells us very little about the health of democracy. I mean, the fact that costs are going up might be a symptom of a system that is more competitive. And I can give you several examples of this. The absolute cost, even if it's going up, and even if it's going up by much, it's not necessarily a sign of democratic pathology. The bad distribution of resources between candidates and between parties, that might well be a sign of democratic pathology. But I can tell you, I'm going to give you a very concrete example, that in Mexico, in the year 2000, if you were battling the PRI that had been in power for 70 years, heck, you had to spend a lot of money. And the fact that the challenger got to spend a lot of money was not a sign of democratic pathology, quite to the contrary. Was a sign of democratic vitality. So let us be aware of the fact that the rise in the absolute cost of campaigns tells us less about the health of democracy than the distribution of resources. The distribution of resources is, I think, much more important. Number 3, the assertion that TV is the culprit that electoral costs are going through the roof. That may or may not be true. It depends on the country. I'm gonna, one of the things that you may find surprising when you delve into the figures and to the details of this is that if you take presidential campaigns in 2008 in this country, just about 20% of the total cost was spent in TV and radio advertising. 20%. That can be a lot, but actually, in the big scheme of things, is not that much. And if you add up to presidential campaigns, the enormous number of local campaigns that are that take place in any given election in the US, very likely you will come up with the figure that Herb Alexander came up with after the 1988 election. That very surprisingly, the late Herb Alexander told us, well, TV advertising is about 10% of the total cost of US elections, which is, by the way, the same figure that I came up with when I did research on this in Costa Rica. So beware. Beware, because it's not so obvious that TV costs are driving electoral costs through the roof. Number 4, this notion that behind every policy decision at every level, there's a campaign donation. Well, correlation is not causation. In a pluralistic political system such as the US, the influences that shape political outcomes are extremely complex. There's ideology, for one. There's all kinds of pre-existing relations between donors and policymakers. And there's lobbying. There's all the money that goes to lobbying as well. One of the things that I find interesting is that when you look into the figures for the years 2007 and 2008, the two industries that invested the most in lobbying efforts, that is the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry, spent 50 times the amount, 55 times the amount that they actually donated to both presidential candidates. So in terms of gauging the influence of money on political outcomes, I would much rather pay attention to what happens when it comes to lobbying what happens when it comes to political donations, to campaign donations. It is at the very least as important, lobbying is at the very least as important as campaign donations, and probably more. My final point is one of hope, if you will, which is that, yes, Citizens United has dramatically altered the campaign finance landscape in the US, but let us not lose sight of the fact that there are countervailing trends, and some of them have been mentioned here. Yes, you have Citizens United, but you also have the internet. And the internet has also dramatically altered the campaign finance landscape. It has basically lowered the enormous transaction costs of going around with your hat collecting small donations, it has lowered those costs practically to zero. And all I'm going to say is that, you know, when it is still an open question whether one influence will prove more powerful than the other, whether the democratic influence set in motion by the internet will prevail over the plutocratic influence set in motion by Citizens United. But one thing I know, that whereas technological changes are irreversible, Supreme Court decisions are not. So, all in all, and with this I finish, my message here is that a more sober view of campaign finance and of campaign finance reform is required. And that we should always remember in this discussion that campaign finance is a field ripe for political posturing. We need more facts and less speeches. And we should be cognizant of the fact that campaign finance reform, even in the best circumstances, is no more than an exercise in damage limitation. That's all it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And thank you to all the speakers. We'll straight away open the floor. If you could raise your hand, we'll have our staff members with microphones. If you could please introduce yourself, and if you have a question to a particular speaker, if you could just mention who that is. I should also mention that if anyone prefers to write down a question and have it written out, have it read out, that's fine as well. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Shola Adeyeye. I'm from Nigeria. I'm a senator of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. My question is twofold and they're related. In those states such as Wisconsin and Virginia, where the super PACs far outspend the candidates, are there some factors responsible for that? Are these candidates so worthy of money that people are willing to give them money, or are there issues that interest people beyond what the candidates themselves are pressing? And related to that, is there a limitation of what a super PAC can spend outside of its origin? For example, you mentioned Donald Trump, very wealthy man from New York, but who knows, regardless of how much money he spends for Mitt Romney will lose New York. So, but can choose to take his money to small states and basically with plenty of money influence those states for Mitt Romney. If you limit what foreigners can bring to the USA, or you say foreigners cannot spend money in the USA because you don't want them to meddle in your internal affairs, should somebody from New York, by elementary logic, also be able to go to another state with plenty of money and buy the election for his candidate in such a state?
Great question. I'll start with the second question first, because I have heard people, particularly from the state of Montana, which just had a case in the Supreme Court where they wanted to regulate super PAC spending and the court said they couldn't. I've heard people say, but this is foreign money. This is outside of Montana money. It comes from New York, or we don't know where it comes from. But the reality is that the law as it currently stands is that the super PACs can spend anywhere in the United States. The nonprofits can spend anywhere in the United States. And you're absolutely right. It is, from what we know, the money is almost always being spent in a state other than the one where the principal funder resides. Your first question was, what is it about states like Wisconsin and Virginia that would lead to so much spending from outside? I think, my colleagues may have other views on it, but I think the answer is because what's at stake here is which party will control the United States Senate. There are 100 senators, so you want 51. In those states, the candidates running, for whatever reason, have not been able to raise as much money as in some other states. They aren't personally rich, they're not spending their own money, and they haven't raised as much. So outside groups have come in and said it's really important that we elect a Republican or a Democrat in this state And so we're going to come in and help them do that. And that's why you're seeing the spending there, because outside groups have said, here is an opportunity for us to win a Senate seat for our national party if we can get it in these states, which are both showing as very close.
Yeah, let me just make one point about your second question and give you a concrete example. The Koch brothers, who are very wealthy in the United States, have decided they want to flip the Arkansas legislature from Democrat to Republican. And so they're very carefully going in and spending money with that in mind.
And they don't live in Arkansas.
Right.
I'll read out a question from the chairman of the Election Commission of Kenya. I think this is meant also for Trevor. You indicated that in some instances a group may spend money on campaign issues, but it is not required to account for the source of its funds. Does this mean that foreign corporations and foreign governments can donate money to this kind of groups?
I'll give a short answer, but I'd really like Commissioner Weintraub to answer because she's the governmental authority who has to enforce that. The answer is because it's undisclosed, it is very hard for us to know what is actually happening with these nonprofits in particular. We have laws on the books that say that foreign entities, foreign companies, foreign individuals are not supposed to spend money in U.S. elections. But, two buts. First, if they're giving to a nonprofit that doesn't disclose their donors, how do we know where the nonprofit's money came from? Secondly, foreign companies may well own companies that are registered in the U.S. And then the law is more complicated because they are supposed to only use money generated by their U.S. operations for U.S. elections. But their books are not public. We don't know where that is coming from. So even if you're a nonprofit and you take money and you know you're not taking it from, was that Nigeria?
Kenya.
From Kenya, but what happens if you're taking it from a U.S. company that is owned by a Kenyan company? How do you know that the money didn't come from Kenya? To me, that's the issue we have here with the lack of disclosure, but Commissioner Weintraub is the one who has to enforce these laws.
Well, I just want to reiterate that it would be illegal, no matter how the money comes in, for foreign money to be spent to try and influence the U.S. election. And were a complaint to be presented to the Federal Election Commission, I can assure you we would take that very seriously and we would investigate that. It's one of the, there are a lot of things that people disagree about in campaign finance issues. Trevor and I are sort of an unusual pair because as a Republican and a Democrat, we probably agree more than we disagree on campaign finance issues. That's not generally the case. Most of my Republican colleagues on the commission, for example, I tend to disagree with them more than I agree with them. But the issue of foreign money in U.S. elections is one that is not terribly controversial here. It's one that's fairly universally accepted as something that we don't want to happen. Now, I think that there are still a number of gray areas in the law. I think even in Trevor's presentation, there were things that he asserted that he said, well, this would be legal. And I said, you know, I'm not so sure that would be legal. I think there are a lot of people out there making assumptions. There's a body of law that developed about separate segregated funds, PACs that were created for corporations in the United States that are wholly owned or otherwise subsidiaries of foreign companies, and under what circumstances those political committees, which collected money exclusively from U.S. citizens working in the United States for a company that happens to be owned by a foreign company, there's a set of rules that evolved on under what circumstances that money could be spent in the United States. Some people assume that that entire same set of rules should apply or does apply to the corporations themselves, to the corporate money that is now able to be spent for the first time in U.S. elections. I'm not at all sure that that's true. We haven't had a lot of court decisions about that, and we haven't had a lot of issues presented to the Federal Election Commission about that. We've been trying to, some members of the commission have been trying to start a rulemaking that would address some of these issues, and we have difficulties getting that rulemaking off the ground for a variety of reasons. But I think there are a lot of things that people assume are okay right now that actually may not be, and even might not be if they were presented to the courts, which haven't had a chance to rule on them yet. There's a lot of new open questions created by Citizens United.
Thank you very much.
Steve Gray, IFES Moldova. We're actually dealing with this issue in Moldova in terms of trying to reform political party finance. And my questions are more kind of logistic and technical. How do you monitor these small undisclosed donations? Is there any attempt to kind of go back and see if they're actually from different individuals, or if, because somebody could, I assume, give a lot of small donations and not, hide the fact that they're giving a large amount of money. And in fact, I could give it to all my 25 friends or whatever and give them certain amounts of money. And then the second question is, how do the parties actually file their expense reports? Is there an electronic template that you've designed and that they have to follow, and how often do they do it?
I guess that's to me. Let me take the second question first. Yes, we put out software, but there are also private vendors who have created software, and they're allowed to use either one. They can either use our software, they can deal with a private vendor if they like their software better. We have technical staff that will work with people and help them if they're having difficulties uploading their reports. If they wait until midnight on the day of or 5 minutes to midnight on the day of the filing day to call up and ask for technical support, they may have a bit of a problem. We do actually keep people on late, but it's not an excuse that you couldn't get your file to upload, and therefore you couldn't get your report filed if you waited until 5 minutes to midnight on the filing deadline to call up and ask for help. But people do sometimes have technical difficulties. We try and give them support. And as I said, there are private vendors who also do that. And by taking these electronic reports in that form, we're able to get them up on the internet really virtually instantaneously. So that's really a very good method of getting the information out. I will say that in the old days, now we've got the internet, and that has opened up a lot of different possibilities, both for campaigning, as Kevin was saying, but also for disclosure. The system was designed in an era before the internet. It was designed in the 1970s. Nobody ever heard of the internet back then. People would fill out pieces of paper and bring them into our office, and we still have a public records room where people can come in and look at the reports if they want to, but now they'll come in and look at them on a computer screen, even in our public records room. And the reason that I say that is that we do put a lot of resources into our technology, but if there are countries that want to have a transparent system and they don't have those kind of resources, it's still possible to have a transparent system where people file reports on paper and they hand them in and they are made available to the public. Usually the media then is the ones that come in and look at the report and help to explain it to people. So I wouldn't want anyone to be discouraged from trying to set up a more transparent system because of a lack of resources. And the parties file generally on a monthly basis. You wanted to add something to that?
If you allow me. Yeah, the question about small donations. Well, it of course depends on what small donation is, but if they're really, really small, even if they're undisclosed, quite frankly, I go back here to my last point, that campaign finance reform is an exercise in damage limitation. Quite frankly, from my standpoint, electoral authorities and watchdog bodies, have better things to do than running around, catching small donors that have given, $100 to a candidate. And bear in mind, and this is one of the issues that comes up whenever donations in kind are discussed, that the voluntary work, that is the time that people, put in, during a campaign or during any kind of mobilization effort, has an economic value as well. And it would be insane, to go around chasing people because they donate $100 of their time to a campaign. So just a word of caution, about going crazy about small donations that go undisclosed.
But let me say a word about that also, and that is that part of this, it's true that we do not go out, and we do have auditors. We do audit a certain number of campaigns. We don't audit every single campaign. We can't. It is, to some degree, a system of voluntary compliance with the risk that if somebody gets wind of the fact that you're not complying properly and files a complaint, you could get in big trouble. It will generate bad publicity in addition to possible financial penalties. And if it's an intentional violation, you could end up going to jail. So there's every reason for a candidate to not want to go about trying to beat the system on these donation limits. And I know that certainly the major campaigns, and Trevor can speak to this because he did it, the major campaigns put an enormous amount of resources into compliance, into hiring lawyers and accountants and specialists to help them keep their reports in order. Part of it is that we live in a country where there is a culture of transparency. We have transparency about not only this, but we ask the candidates to file personal financial disclosure statements. When government agencies hold meetings, they have to do them in public. There's a lot of transparency. It's an accepted part of the culture. People expect it. And frankly, if a candidate were seen to be trying to do an end run on these kinds of disclosure requirements, I think the voters would not look kindly on that candidate. They would probably lose some support for looking like they were trying not to comply with the law. And I think there's a certain amount of cultural, I don't know what's the right word for it. There are other ways of enforcing the law besides having a government agency come in with a big club all the time. And the voters are one good way. The media watches people, and the voters also can impose some discipline.
I thought it might just be helpful to clarify, though, how it actually works, which is when you saw those slides about, 55% of the Obama campaign were small donors. What happens is the campaigns take money over the internet. Those small donors, I think, are going to be almost entirely over the internet. When they do that, they are required to take it in the form of a credit card or a bank card with identifying information. And so if I give over the internet, which I do, I have to put in my credit card number, my name, my address, etc. The campaign is required to keep that information. And if I give $10, they don't have to report my name to the Federal Election Commission. But if I then go and give another $20, they have to keep that information. If I give a total of $200 in that whole campaign, so $10, $20, $30, it keeps adding up, it reaches $200, they are then required to report my name and address on their Federal Election Commission form. So we do know every donor over $200, whether they gave it once or whether they gave it a number of times that added up to that. And the campaigns have to keep records, which can be audited by the Federal Election Commission, of the donors below 200 if they took their money.
Thank you very much. We do have a lot of questions. We do not have a lot of time. I will read out one question from the President of the Electoral Commission of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. With your permission, so I'll limit it to part of that question. Do you have concrete cases of corruption regarding campaign finance in recent elections that anyone wants to share?
Yes. If the question is, do we have concrete cases of corruption? We had there are two answers to that. One, we have concrete cases of corruption, by which we mean individuals took money and then were alleged to have done government action. Now, that's not really campaign finance. That is bribery. People go to jail for that at various levels of the government. There are investigations of that and court cases. It happens in any system. You have some bad apples who will do something for money. But in the campaign finance system, we had a period of time in the late 1990s, around 2000, where the parties could take unlimited money from corporations and wealthy individuals, and that was, a number of people thought that was corrupting. That's what the reform law called McCain-Feingold was designed to address. And in the course of that law being written and discussed in Congress and then challenged in the courts and defended, there was a very long record of instances which showed corruption in the system. And by that I mean that Congress would not take up particular issues because a company had just made a large donation to a political party, or amendments would or would not be offered because of the supporters of the party. There were allegations in 1996 that President Clinton had not only had wealthy individuals to the White House, but had given them special access in return for their campaign contributions. So the standard we used was either corruption or the appearance of corruption. The fact that the public looking at this would think that somebody was getting special access or special results from the government because of the amount of money they had given. And there was a significant amount of testimony, particularly from former members of Congress, who said this was their belief that that's how the system was working.
Although the Supreme Court has just told us that access doesn't equal corruption. So we're somewhat limited in our ability to address that sort of corruption, which I agree with Trevor can be real.
Thank you very much. I have a number of questions in front of me, and we have more questions from the floor. Unfortunately, what we do not have is time. So I wish to apologize to those of you who have questions. I also want to say the speakers will hopefully stay with us for lunch. Please, everyone who have a question, do come up to them and ask questions so we can continue the discussion. I want to thank the speakers for illustrating this issue from many different angles. As you can see, this is a very complex issue. And I'm looking forward to having the same panel for the 2016 elections as well. The next session...
Something has changed by that.